And with that, we should be live. Greetings to everybody who's watching this. For those of you in the chat, if you could just give us a shout out to let us know the audio is working. Give it a second or two. Looks like we lost somebody there for a second. All right, well, welcome everyone to part 2 of the Darkstream, the politics of Brave New World. When last we left off, we were talking about the caste system and breeding centers, and we discussed a whole variety of topics. In that time, we've all finished the book, and we'll be covering a lot more, talking about issues of life, death, social conformity, liberty, emotions, and what it means to be human. Joined with me now are Dracky3k from Athens. Say hello.
Hi there.
And Wunkerful from, and last time I got this wrong, he's joining us from the Healthy Gamer server, not the Blue Politics server.
Hey, how's it going?
And unfortunately, the fourth guest, whom I had promised last time, is not going to be able to make it again. We wish them well, but we will soldier on without them. So if you haven't watched part 1 of this, recommend that you do so. Check out the VOD when you can, because we're going to be building off of that. In the meantime, Dracky, since this is your first time reading Brave New World, we'll start with you again. Now that you've finished the book, what did you think?
Yeah, so it kind of stays as grim as the beginning. It's actually got a pretty even tone to it, narration-wise, which is kind of like it just indicates that this isn't really like an event in the world portrayed in the book, but rather just like a zoom in, and everything kind of goes back to business as usual.
That it's sort of a snapshot of life as it is, rather than sort of a narrative triumph over some particular problem.
Yeah, it gets away from the usual, as there is no hero's journey.
And as you were reading, what did you think of some of the commentary that Wunkel and I had put forward last time? Did any of that start to resonate with you as you were reading through those parts?
Yeah, it all started falling into place. But particularly the bits with John and Mustafa.
Yeah, we'll get to John and Mustafa in a minute. So last we left off, you'd read up to chapter 5.
Yeah, that's correct.
So following that, given that this stream is going to be talking about primarily issues of life and death, chapter 5 opens up with John and Lenina in a helicopter as they're passing the crematorium. And one thing I found particularly interesting about that scene was their musing about how pretty much whoever was, they don't actually know who it was that's being cremated. All they see is the smoke. And whoever it was, they know that they were happy in life. And it's also interesting that death seems to be the great equalizer, that it doesn't matter what caste you were in life, you go to the same place in the end.
You get harvested for your phosphorus.
And then the phosphorus, in turn, is used to create new life. So it's sort of a circle of life and death, reincarnation, as it were. As a pagan, I actually prefer cremation over burial. I just think it makes a lot more sense physically, spiritually. If there is a transcendent soul, then it would stand to reason that you don't want it necessarily trapped in the body. And the body itself is kind of useless beyond just its atoms at that point. So why not recycle it? So that part I actually agree with. I know there are plenty of Christians and Muslims and other religions out there who prefer to bury their dead. Personally, I don't see the logic in that. I actually agree more with the way that they treat the corpses in Brave New World. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it's very utilitarian, and I mean, I think the main function of burying people in graveyards is that it serves a utility for the family members, right? So in terms of like family members that are not willing to let go of their family members, it gives them a place to go to like visit with those departed people. But in this world, there's no familial attachments, and so then the utility is no longer of the graveyard is no longer needed, pretty much. Yeah.
I think also it's actually pretty funny how it's handled in Brave New World. It's kind of similar to how it's handled now. I mean, even with the current crisis that's going on, there's kind of like a huge thing about mortuaries and going through that whole process now as well.
Yeah, so as we're recording this, we're currently gripped in the midst of the COVID-19 novel coronavirus pandemic, and we're hearing stories about places like Iran are having to do unprecedented mass burials, so much so that they can't even keep up with the religious services. They're just dumping them into mass graves. And then over in China, they're getting mass shipments of funerary urns, while at the same time pretending that all is well and that there is no outbreak.
Seems it's the one thing that's not made in China.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I feel like a lot of thing with like religious thought is that they don't want the bodies to be touched or messed with. And I think that's where like the coffin comes from. But in this technologically driven world of Brave New World, you know, all of that, the touchiness around death is literally conditioned out of them by taking them to the hospital. And you see that later in the book when John's mother gets put there.
Yeah, so one of the books that Mustafa Mond has in his library is, let me see if I can, it's called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And it's basically, it was written by William James in 1902. And he was setting out to study religious mysticism and religious experience from a psychological and phenomenological perspective. And his work is very much based on the philosophy of pragmatism, which seems to be something that carries through the world state. Everything is about what's practical, what's useful. I forget which character it was who was saying how dreaded it is that they preserve bodies for some kind of monument, that strikes them as very vain and narcissistic and worshiping of something that they perceive doesn't even exist.
Yeah, I don't remember that part in the book, but it sounds right, right? Because they're all about getting rid of sentimentality, right? That's like the main enemy because That's like an emotional clinginess, and they don't want that. They want people to just like mold into the masses.
You brought up the topic of death therapy. So we didn't touch on this in the last stream too much, but the children, when they're around, I think they're a little older than toddlers at this point. They're maybe 7 years old, because it's suggested, as we had talked about, that they are encouraged to engage in sexual play. So children, when they're 7, are brought to the crematorium and the hospice care, and they're given rewards to sort of use Pavlovian conditioning to make them see death not as something to be feared or anxious or sad about, but rather something to be joyful and celebrated. And I actually think that the hospice care, apart from one issue, which we'll touch on in a minute, is probably one of the more humane and sensible aspects of the world state, in that, you know, people fear the specter of mortality, but if you can condition them to go with grace and joy, that kind of is a mercy in many ways. The only downside is that for those people like John who have those familial bonds, they're not allowed to grieve, and grieving is actually seen as harmful and disruptive to the social order.
Yeah, and I think the point is made that the reason grieving is necessary is because there's a buildup of that tension over the years as you age and you see them dying and everything. So then it's a big point in the book that there is no aging, and that there is no like process of becoming old, and they're horrified by old people.
Yeah, so when the children finally go in to see Linda on her deathbed, they're shocked and amused and horrified, and basically treat her as some sort of carnival freak show, because they see her and she's fat and ugly and grotesque. And, you know, I'll be honest, when reading the descriptions of Linda in the book, I kind of pictured Amy Schumer.
Oh no, not that mean.
But yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, because I think also they were talking about how the hospice where they brought John's mother, how everyone there was they were still physically fine, but they were succumbing to things like dementia and those ills.
Yeah, so they could cure physical ailments and give them essentially eternal youth, where even if they're 60 or 65, they still look like young adults and teenagers. I believe there was something technical about the fact that they could only live to be about 65.
Yeah, something like the heart or some of their organs.
It also might have to do with the fact that they don't necessarily put a lot of care into sustaining people, because people are easily replaceable. And as they're getting older and weaker, it's like, well, they have that hypnopedic suggestion that says ending is better than mending. So one would reasonably assume that applies to human beings as well, that it's better to just end that person's life because we can just go and print another one.
Yeah, probably.
But the hospice care itself is actually, it's actually pretty humane. I mean, Linda is allowed to watch TV. There's plenty of perfume scents in the air. Everything is sterile, and there's happy music playing. And it's really just trying to get them comfortable and happy as they're on their way out, which frankly is a lot better than a lot of people get.
Yeah, but the situation of why she ends up in hospice care is kind of messed up, because she's literally taking so much soma that it's killing her, and the doctors can't see any reason to stop her from doing that, because when she doesn't take it, she becomes angry and they don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, so ever since Linda got back from the savage reservation, she pretty much has been constantly just drugging herself up on soma in a perpetual stupor. And then when John brings this up to the doctors tell him that there's the risk that she'll develop respiratory infection as a result of that, which I thought was kind of chilling.
Well, it's not infection. It's literally like the lungs stop working or whatever.
Yeah, respiratory failure is what I meant, not infection. So something about the soma, probably because it's a psychotropic drug, or we don't actually know. We know it's a pill, but for whatever reason, it winds up degrading the lung function, which is kind of chilling in how synchronous it is, because right now, what is the world going through? Right now, we're going through a global flu pandemic, which primarily affects the respiratory function. The biggest thing on everybody's mind right now is having to have a ventilator. And in the last stream, we had talked about the timing of all of this and how the 9 Years' War takes place. It starts in 2049, and they use a lot of biological weapons. And we hadn't really gotten to talk about China, which I think you guys had wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, because part of the reason why China is claiming that they've been able to shut off the virus, even though we don't know if that's true, is because of the amount of social monitoring they have on their population. Because in terms of the tech realm, there's literally no limitations on the Chinese government. Like they're literally trying to digitize like each and every citizen and have like ultimate control over each of them in a way.
Well, not just the control aspects, but they're also brainwashed through state propaganda, much like in Brave New World, where everything that they believe has been socially engineered. So, like, the world state in Brave New World is kind of the Chinese wet dream in many sense.
Yeah, because I think it's like the Chinese Communist Party. Their whole thing is that they're trying to promote social harmony, and that's literally what like community stability identity is all about. That's like the monstrous version of harmony.
And in Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucianism and Buddhism, there is a strong emphasis on one's place in the social hierarchy.
No, yeah, because Confucianism is all about convention, right? And so it's all about accepting your role amongst the things that have been agreed upon in terms of forming the world that you're born into.
While we're on the subject of China, I thought it was interesting that Mustafa Mond, in his conversation with John, is talking about how successful that they've been in executing the world state, and he says that even China and those primitive matriarchies weren't as stable as we are. And I thought that's interesting because China is trying desperately to maintain an image of social stability right now. And then in terms of the matriarchal societies, you have a lot of the progressive-led countries such as Scandinavia or Germany that are also struggling to maintain that image as well, because they fear that if they don't do that, then things are going to regress in terms of women's rights, for instance. And so Brave New World, even though it was written at a time before the feminist movement and before all of this nasty business going on with China, it still kind of predicted a lot of that stuff in a way, and it's still very applicable.
So being written at the time that it was talking about China, he was looking at the history of China, how they're like the longest empire or longest civilization that currently exists right now, right? They have like thousands of years of history. But what's so interesting is that what happened in just the decades after this book is that they had when did the revolution happen where they kicked out all of the Communist Party came into being after the 1930s, right? And so they sort of like erased a lot of that history. And then even from the 1980s onward, the capitalist revolution in China is wiping out their history even more. So it's hard to argue that China as it is today in 2020 is necessarily even recognizable as the China from all of the history behind it.
Yeah, so the revolution began in 1946, but was the part of the Chinese Civil War since 1927.
So what's interesting about that is that this technological and like communist revolution in China has really like disconnected them from the heritage that they've sort of prided themselves on and that they've been respected for around the world. They're definitely a very different thing these days.
And what does Mustafa Mann say in Brave New World? That there is no place for art or history or science, that everything is controlled and engineered for practical purposes to give these people happiness and meaning, which again is oddly parallels what's going on in China right now. You know, they're erasing any sort of freedom of expression, they're controlling what everybody says, and they're erasing and rewriting their own history. In fact, all of the communist countries do that. Stalin, for instance, famously, uh, before Photoshop was invented, photoshopped out people from photos that were his political enemies.
And I think I've watched documentaries about the propaganda in China about the war films. You know, like they have like Saving Private Ryan-esque propaganda films, or like the propaganda films from what was it? The Quentin Tarantino movie, Inglourious Bastards. And there's that main character who's like the sniper, and he does the propaganda films in the movie. It's like I think China today is still doing propaganda films like that, where it stokes up these feelings about the Chinese fighting the Japanese in World War II and stuff like that.
I didn't really see the movie, so I can't really comment on that. I know that North Korea, for instance, had been doing that for a while as well, with regards to the Kim dynasty, where they built him up to be this glorious, godly figure, and then erase any memory of the fact that anybody is suffering. So even if they are suffering, you're not allowed to speak about it lest you cause social unrest.
And funny enough, as well, on with regards to the propaganda films, there's actually been a sort of resurgence in Hollywood after they've discovered the markets. Like two films that come to mind was the second last Transformers movie, um, and the Iron Man 2, I believe it was. Where there was actually a special cut of Iron Man 2 for the Chinese market, where they had him in a Chinese hospital where they were operating on his reactor to stop the poisoning.
Interesting.
So they literally had China save Tony Stark.
Yeah, quite literally. And the thing is, it was like one of those. They just kind of like slipped it in at the end of the movie.
And the irony, of course, is that Tony Stark is like the epitome of capitalism in every respect. And Americanism, short, second only to Captain America.
No, yeah, so they literally put the American like entrepreneur like at the hands of, you know, Chinese expertise. It's like that's a really big kowtow.
I think it's probably the two of them between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. They're probably the most representative of America, at least in the international mind.
No, yeah, I mean that's literally what they are as characters. Like Captain America is the American spirit, and Tony Stark is like the American ambition.
Bringing this back to the current topic, um, even though they've pretty much done away with religion, they still have sort of a parallel to religion in their solidarity services, which is basically church. and then we see
Fordism.
Bernard. Fordism, yes. Have either of you two seen Iron Sky?
No, I haven't.
Yeah,
Drac,
same as me. I haven't.
did you watch the second one? Dracky, did you watch
No,
this?
I didn't.
So in the second film, all right. So for anybody who doesn't know, Iron Sky is basically this sci-fi film where, following World War II, Nazis took over the moon and created a space base there, and then they launch a counteroffensive against the rest of the world. And then in the second movie, it follows the refugees from the war between the moon Nazis and Earth. And among the survivors on the moon, where all the last remaining human beings live, they have a religion called Jobsism, which is sort of a modern take on Fordism, where they worship Steve Jobs. And instead of replicating Ford's Model T technology, they replicate and venerate Apple technology. And then it turns out that uh, Steve Jobs is one of the villains in the movie as well.
How long until we get Muskism?
Till we get Elon Musk, yeah.
I mean, I think we already do have that because like he himself has like started memeing, like he's like picked up on like the zeitgeist pretty much at this.
He's sort of a cult of personality in many.
No, yeah, for sure, definitely.
Speaking of cults, though, my impression of the solidarity groups that Bernard goes to is that they're basically like a death cult in many ways. The main girl that he goes to see, her name is Morgana Rothschild, and Morgana is famously known as the sister of King Arthur, and it's one of his foils. Let me just pull up my notes here. So they drink soma and sing. So the soma is basically their version of communion, and in many ways it parallels the traditional Catholic mass. And so as they're drinking the soma, one of the things they recite is, "I drink to my annihilation." Essentially, they're killing off individuality in the attempt to become one with their other brothers and sisters. And then afterwards, they wind up having a massive orgy with one another.
No, 12 is one.
Yes, 12 is. I drink to the greater being. Did either of you see the TV series Sense8?
No, yeah, I saw that.
I started watching it.
So I had a little bit of. I was reminded of that as well, and the idea that they're all psychically connected and they can actually feel what everybody else feels. That was kind of the impression of what I think the aim of the solidarity groups was, even though they didn't have the ability to actually implement it to that same degree. And a lot of the feelies that they go to see, which are basically haptic feedback VR, tries to recreate that as well, where they can actually feel the experiences of somebody else.
Well, yeah, I think if Brave New World, if they had the technology to like mind meld people, they would absolutely do it because they're not doing this for I don't know, what is it, for malevolent reasons. They're doing very brute means of trying to create peace. So I think if they had a better means like Sensei of doing things, they would do it like that.
I think it was also pretty funny that they had Leonard Nimoy as Mustafa Mond in the film.
Did you actually watch it?
No, I just watched a couple of clips.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Spock is very much about the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And so everything in the world state is geared towards collectivism. Everybody belongs to everybody else. And then in the solidarity service, they say, Forward we are 12, make us one. We long to die, for when we end, our larger life has just begun. So any and all sense of individuality or separateness is completely eliminated, even in a spiritual sense.
Yeah, and I don't think there's inherently anything wrong with collectivism, but this is like showing what happens when you value it over everything else.
Yeah, many religions actually talk about the idea that everybody is one. The concept of atonement, for instance, when understood in the occult sense, means at one meant. So to atone, we always think of making amends, of doing penance. But really, if you break it down into those two words, at one, it's sort of reconnecting to the spirit within, the spirit that exists in everything. And so you're rejoining the collective.
No, yeah, and that's the basis of every religion. Every religious philosophy talks about the idea that um, at birth or whatever, life has divided itself up, and the goal is to try and reunite back into the divine being.
On the subject of the divine, so let me pull up my notes here. So in chapter 17, John goes to talk to John is left alone to talk to Mustafa Mond, and Mond pulls out his personal library of books from his safe, and among them is the Holy Bible, but also a book called The Imitation of Christ, which after the Bible is regarded as the second most widely read Christian book. Just pulling up my notes on that right now. If you guys want to comment on that.
Well, it's just interesting that John wasn't even interested in it. Like, I think he just like flipped past it and he was like, whatever, I don't want that. Because I think it points to the fact that people always like fiction more than like religious texts, because the fiction allows it respects their individual feelings a lot more than the religious texts do.
It's actually surprising that John isn't more interested in those things, given how interested in Shakespeare he is and how heavily influenced Shakespeare was by Christianity. And here Mond is showing him some of the most prominent works of Christian philosophy. So I have my notes up. It says, The Imitation of Christ was written in the 15th century, the second most read Christian book after the Bible. It talks about rejecting the vanities and illusions of the world in favor of quiet reflection, discipline, and stoicism, which is pretty much the fate that John ends up in towards the end of the book once he leaves the world state.
Yeah, and him choosing to leave is really like the turn that his character takes is really interesting, because he's being driven towards his romantic interests, but as soon as he discovers that the world isn't going to be able to participate in that in the way that he wants, it starts to like get to him, and it takes like a dark turn.
Well, he leaves because Mond wouldn't let him go to the islands with the others. And
Oh
he's
yeah,
actually,
yeah.
yeah, so he actually wants to go with, okay, so let me back up a second for anybody who hasn't read it. So for people like Mustafa Mond and like John and like Helmholtz and Bernard, who can't conform to the rest of civilization, the solution that they found was similar to like we were talking about in the previous streams with those who walk away from Omelas. They're exiled to any of a number of islands. And throughout the course of civilization, this is built up to be a bad thing, but I think I think the only reason they do that is to try and preserve stability of society. Whereas if they said, oh, this is a great place, people will love it here, then people would become naturally curious of that and want to go there. So they propagandize them to think that it's some horrible punishment, when Mond says it's actually a reward, because they wind up meeting very interesting people there. And John, for his part, that seems like his ideal. That would be the thing that he would want most in life, because he was rejected by the savage reservation, by his own people, and then he was also rejected by the world state civilization. So the only other place left for him, much like with Helmholtz and Bernard, is to go to one of the islands. But Mond expressly says he forbids him from going, because he wants to continue the experiment in seeing the way in which the savage interacts with the rest of civilization. Now, I happen to think that he anticipated that John would want to flee and go off and be by himself, and that the experiment was actually to see how civilization would react to his absence, and would they go out and try to find him. And so pretty much everything that happened from that point onward, in my opinion, was part of the experiment that the world controller was trying to see play out.
Yeah, well, so I'm thinking about the turn that John took. So once he was denied being able to go there, he's in sort of like a state of despair. But then he becomes fixated on trying to make himself good, even though he can receive no reward for being good. It's almost like he starts to go to war with his desires. So every time he thinks about Lenina, it angers him, and he wants to like drive those thoughts out of him. And that's like why he brings out the whip and everything, is that he's trying to hide from the desires that he knows will never be able to be satisfied.
So because he's unique, Lenina, even though she was initially repulsed by him and the fact that he was born vivaricously and had parents and a family and all the other manner of things that the savage reservation had that civilization doesn't, even though she was initially repulsed by him, she's still struck by the fact that he's different and unique and interesting, and she's physically attracted to him as well and tries to have sex with him, whereas he, because he's been conditioned through the religious experience of his own people, and also through the works of Shakespeare, and Shakespeare emphasizes chastity as a virtue. He wants to wait until marriage, but Lenina doesn't understand what marriage is, and so he rejects her even as she's coming on to him, and calls her a strumpet, a whore, and physically beats her for this. And then at the same time, he also punishes himself for having unclean thoughts. And he also blames himself for being the cause of Linda's death, either in being born or in bringing her here or whatever.
No, yeah, and what's really interesting about Lenina and John is that they're both trying to work towards the concept of love, but they're coming at it from different perspectives. So John's coming at it from the perspective of you have to be really like careful and soft about it, and then Lenina's coming from the perspective of the Brave New World, which is that you just like smash into things. But both of them have that like hint or that suspicion in them that there's something like there's potential between them, right? Because she's like, she keeps calling him queer, but she likes it. And then so even though he like hits her or whatever, he does something weird, she comes back because she's catching hints of like this love that could be between them. And same for John. And so I guess he ends up like feeling like the loss of that really badly, which is why he gets so dejected.
One thing that I think Huxley does very well is he's really good at holding up parallel mirrors. So you have these two clashing worlds, and they're at pretty much every stage throughout the book. We have two opposite extremes coming face to face with one another, and they have sort of a reciprocal response to each other, whether it's birthing or parenting, or the way that people's physical bodies are treated in the case of Linda being horribly obese, monogamy, and so forth. At every stage along the way, each thinks the other is strange or horrifying or inappropriate. There is no real parallel until the very end of the book to our own civilization. You either have the world state extreme communism, or you have the hyper primitive savage reservation. There isn't really anything left in between. So you have both of those extremes coming in clash with one another. You have people loving slavery versus John's reaction being shocked and horrified at them not wanting to be free, and Helmholtz and Bernard shocked and horrified at them not wanting to be free as well.
I think that also kind of hits on a very big narrative in our own post-slavery world. It's often a like a very big thing where people would say that they lived better, if we say in like the States. I think it was J.C. Lee Peterson. He said that they were treated far better in the U.S. during the slavery times than now afterwards.
Well, you've lived in South Africa and the UK, right?
Yeah, so in South Africa, it wasn't, well, at least round about my own time, it wasn't so much slavery as it was with
Apartheid.
separation. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, isn't there a sentiment among some people in South Africa now where they say that they were better off under apartheid before they got their own emancipation? And then I've heard stories of people who have the sentiment in former British colonies as well. They say that they were better off under British rule rather than their own rule, and they have this sense that things sort of went to shit once the empire left.
Yeah, so it's in for South Africa, one of the big things was service delivery, where it's kind of so the new government that took over, they are often horribly inept. So just recently there was huge water source shortages, which at the beginning was flagged due to drought. But then after a lot of digging, they actually found out that the the government just wasn't keeping up with infrastructure upgrades. So it's like little things like that, like little blocks of bureaucracy.
And that's sort of the case that Mustafa Mond makes as well to John, saying that, these people would be, well, first of all, they hold happiness to be the highest good rather than truth and beauty. And so, because they hold happiness as the highest good, they came to realize through not just theory, but also in practice, that many people were grossly unhappy being free and not having their whole life essentially plotted out for them, that they needed a form of external structure to their lives, telling them what to do, giving them a role to fulfill, and that if they took that away, because the biggest threat to society is instability, and if that chaos was allowed to come in, they wouldn't know how to deal with it. And in fact, John's overall critique of civilization is essentially that it's too fragile, that it doesn't know how to deal with catastrophe and calamity, like we had talked about last time in regards to Demolition Man, how they had to rely on something from the past, something monstrous and horrible by their own standards, in order to deal with anything like that.
Yeah, but what's interesting about that is that John himself is a proof of the pitfalls of the old world, which is that when you don't have stability and conformity, what happens is people can get driven off the deep end and kill people.
Well, I would say that John is probably the closest thing we have to sort of an Aristotelian mean, but he himself has not actually reached that point because he still is very much violent and cynical. Whereas if he were allowed to go to the islands, I think he would have. I think he would have found that middle ground, and I think Huxley even agrees that the ending that he wrote was kind of shit, which is why he wrote The Island as the follow-up to that, saying like, well, what if he actually was allowed to go to the island?
Yeah, well, it doesn't make sense in universe, right? Because the island and all of society is like a big in club, and the reality is that John isn't in the club. So like the way that they treat, say, Bernard versus John is really funny because like Bernard is far more disliked than John in every way. But for some reason with Bernard, they still let him go to the island, even though there's literally like nothing likable about him, simply because he's one of them and John isn't.
I think part of that is they know that John is a savage, that he hasn't been conditioned, and so he doesn't have the same expectation that somebody like Bernard has. They don't really expect much of him. They understand that, okay, this is what a savage is supposed to be, whereas Bernard is supposedly an alpha, yet he acts very strangely. He acts individualistic. He has tendencies towards monogamy and interest in beauty and culture and other things that, frankly, all of his conditioning should make him feel ashamed for, but he doesn't.
I actually have a strange feeling that the island, well, when they go to Iceland, that's actually another experiment in a similar vein to the Cyprus experiments.
Well, they don't actually go to Iceland. The director threatens him with getting sent off to Iceland, but like I said, they probably only think of it as a curse and a punishment because they need that narrative to maintain social stability. Where they actually wind up going is the Falkland Islands. And I had actually looked this up. Falkland is either Gaelic for enclosure or Anglo-Saxon for folkland. So enclosure in the sense of it being a prison, but folkland as in land held by folk right. Now, what is folk right? Folk right is an ancient Anglo-Saxon form of communal tribal law presided by a council of elders in a sort of hybrid democratic republic, feudalist. It's a combination of like democratic republicanism, feudalism, and anarcho-communism. It's really hard to describe. That was the closest I could get to. So it's essentially a bottom-up representative form of government, which is what we were talking last time. Huxley himself kind of saw as the ideal form of social order. So they're going off to essentially rule themselves according to whatever dictates they decide rather than what's imposed on them by the world state. So people wind up self-policing, and it's up to each individual victim or their families to seek out justice and meaning. And
Kind of like a Brave New World version of the Savage Reserve.
yeah, it's halfway between the savage reserve and civilization.
No, yeah, and that makes sense because when John talks to Mond brings up like all these experiments that they've tried and like hundreds of years ago. Like they bring up the Alpha Island they tried out and stuff. So the implication is that they've run all these experiments over the years and they've sort of reached this steady state in society, and they've sort of like figured out like the perfect formula that makes everything work, and that's where they are at in the book.
Something that we had talked about last time was Huxley had written all of this prior to considerations about automation, AI, and genetic engineering. And so we were discussing, what happens to all of the lower castes who become obsolete because they invent newer technologies. And as I was rereading through John and Bernard's discussion with Mustafa Mond, I sort of had a different understanding than I did the first time we talked about this, in that Huxley kind of sort of answers that in Mond's dialogue, because you have the Cyprus Experiment, which the Cyprus Experiment is basically, okay, well, everybody is now artists and scientists, but it turns out that that created instability and unhappiness. So the island of Cyprus in 473 AF, which is 2381 AD, is given over to nothing but alphas, and they're given all of the equipment they need, anything that they could ever want, sort of like the mouse utopia experiment we were talking about last time. And the result of that experiment was massive inequality and instability, because even though everybody was smart and capable and given all the tools they needed, there was still a hierarchy of labor. Some people still had to do boring, menial tasks, and they hated that because they were conditioned to be alphas. And so this resulted in massive inequality and instability. And those people that had the cushy jobs were trying to protect them, whereas those that didn't have them essentially formed a workers' uprising and revolt against them. And civil war broke out within 6 years, and 19,000 of the initial 22,000 were killed, with the remaining 3,000 begging the world government to step in and essentially save them from themselves.
Yeah, so I think that these islands they get sent to are still technically ruled by the world controllers. It's just that in their off hours, in their free time, they get to hang out with each other and be a bit happier.
I don't think it's necessarily that they rule over them. It's sort of like a quarantine zone in a way, where it's like, okay, you can go and play. We've set up a little safe space for you to go and exercise whatever kinds of independence and individuality you want, but you're confined to the island. So hence what I was saying before about Falkland being an enclosure and a prison in a way. So like you can't leave the island, but within the island you can do whatever you want.
Well, I think the Falkland and Iceland and all of those would devolve into the Cyprus situation unless there's something different about how Falkland and Iceland are being run. And I think the implication is that they still have jobs and everything over there. They're still technically a part of the world.
Well, what I would think is different is that probably it's not made exclusively of alphas, that there are probably people from other civilizations or who've just been descendants of people who were there for generations. Because, like in the book, it's implied that the world state takes over everything, but they kind of don't. There are still pockets of civilization, like the Savage Reservation, for instance, that are still outside of world control. And so, just like we were talking about how China curates this sort of isolationist, all encompassing view of the world, where they have total control over everything that's inside of it, there's still a world that goes on outside of it that they have no contact with other than very limited and controlled manners. So, like, to even go to the Savage Reservation, Bernard needed special dispensation from the director and the world controller themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, another, we had talked briefly about this last time, another movie that sort of echoes a lot of the same themes of Brave New World, right down to the bottling of infants and social conditioning, is The Matrix. And so the Cyprus Experiment sort of parallels Neo's meeting with the architect, where Neo is the one, he's an anomaly that essentially rises up against the collectivization of human beings and their control. And so he meets with the architect, and the architect explains to him that, you know, we originally were designed to serve humans, and we created a paradise for you, but you rejected it in favor of something more closely resembling the world as you knew it before us, essentially our time. So they were given paradise, but there were those that rejected it. And so for those who rejected it, they needed a way out, and that's why the machines allow Zion to exist. And Neo says that the problem with their system is it removes all forms of choice. And so much like what Bernard and the others go through, the problem is with choice, that people aren't given the free will and the option to choose for themselves. The exception being John, because he isn't socially conditioned. And in the end, he says, I willingly choose to take on all the sufferings and unhappiness of the world.
No, and that's like Bernard's situation, right? Is that he feels like the reason he's a doomer or whatever is because he feels like he has no choice, because he would absolutely be included and be a normal person if he could make that happen, but it feels like it's out of his hands, and so then he just ends up depressed.
So people like Helmholtz and Bernard would essentially be like the population of Zion in the Matrix, the people that wake up to the prison that they're in. And then it's like, okay, well, they need some way of resolving that within their own minds to ease their own consciousness. And the way that they deal with that is to leave the system. I don't know if you guys ever watch Film Theory, the YouTube channel.
No.
Yeah, occasionally.
Okay, so Matt Pat runs the Film Theory channel, and he had an episode talking about how you can't ever actually leave the Matrix. And the idea that Zion and the war and all of that is still perfectly within the Matrix. It's just one level removed and abstracted out of it. It's essentially the machine's way of controlling and isolating and dealing with the people who reject their initial perfect system. And so much like what you were saying, how islands like the Falklands and Cyprus and Iceland and so forth are still kind of within a limited form of control of the world state. He argues that Zion and the One are also under some sort of control, but it's a looser control. So they don't feel controlled. Mond even talks about this in his monologue where he's saying, everybody is put on rails, but if you're an alpha, you're put in a bottle, but our bottles are a lot bigger and we have more room to swim around. And if you put us in a tinier bottle, we would be really unhappy.
No, yeah, and that's literally like Helmholtz, right? He's outgrown the alpha role, and he's trying to do more than that, and he's just like he's disillusioned from all of it because he doesn't have a big enough bottle.
And yet he doesn't have the wherewithal to understand things like Shakespeare because of his conditioning. So a lot of it seems very strange to him, yet it's part of that bigger pool that he wants to be in. So he's finding himself as a little fish in a bigger pond.
Well, yeah, and I think partly is that he has less reasons to let go of his conditioning, just because he's like the content version of Bernard. So Bernard's the sad version, and Helmholtz is the happy version. And so I think with time, he'll probably push against that conditioning more, but he's not necessarily as unraveled as Bernard is.
And then if they ever went on to have children off in the islands, then their own children wouldn't be conditioned. They would be closer to what John is, but they would be a healthier form of it because they aren't having to live in the squalor and abuse and violence that is the savage reservation. They have something that is tempered by civilization, the way that Linda tried to temper John's savage nature.
Well, yeah, and Linda wasn't capable of caring for him because she was like a normal conditioned person. She wasn't like a malcontent.
Yeah, she didn't go into it willingly. She was thrust into it involuntarily because she was abandoned by the.
Yeah, and so I think like Lenina is actually like the most interesting character of the book because she's a content person. She's the popular person. She's the normal person. There's like literally nothing wrong with her. And then she still ends up liking Bernard and liking John. So it's sort of like it's showing how the system isn't perfect, because even the most perfect person for the system is going to see out of it a little bit.
In rereading it, I actually had sort of a change of heart about Lenina and how I feel about her. So I actually think she's much more interesting in the movie adaptation of her, where she's given more personality and the opportunity to be an individual and a mother. But in the book, she's pretty much just a brainwashed idiot who's a drug addict and a whore. That's literally her entire personality.
No, but it's understandable, because she's dealing with the soma and lifelong conditioning and all of her friends and everything. So the more I read it, the more I respect her, because she's capable of seeing beyond all of that. She's still able to peek through it and then have these feelings of queerness about John and Bernard that attracts herself to them.
I think also on top of that, it's pretty funny how with John and Lena, where John calls her a strumpet, but at the beginning of the book, she actually gets teased for it, that she's a bit of the opposite.
No, yeah. There's hints that she's sort of a monogamous person, because she wants to be with Henry, and she's been with him too long. And then what's really interesting is that at the very end, when she shows up in the helicopter during like the craziness, she comes back with Henry. So she went back to Henry in the end.
What you were talking about just now, Dracky, sort of echoes what I was saying earlier about how Huxley is very good at holding up parallel mirrors. So she's originally mocked and ridiculed for having monogamous tendencies towards Bernard, but then she turns around and mocks and derides and just doesn't understand monogamy in the sense that John is talking about. And there's a huge theme of everybody just being shallow and traitorous to one another. So we see that with Lenina turning on John. We see it with Bernard turning on his friends. Bernard eventually turning on John at the party. Society turning on Bernard. Society turning on the director turning on Linda.
I actually
Society. Go ahead.
With regards to that, it's not so much turning on, but something that struck me with like for instance when John and Linda first meet up with the director, it's like the entire population is infantile and kind of in modern day terms stuck at that like 12 to 14-year-old mentality.
Yeah, but what I was getting at is there are no lasting bonds between people. That it's a very utilitarian relationship. So you look at something like the High Songster, who's basically a cardinal in their solidarity service. He winds up using Lenina because she's attractive. She invites him to go to Bernard's party, and he's only interested in Bernard. And most people are only interested in Bernard because of his relationship to John, not because of anything inherent to himself. And Bernard is only interested in John partly out of curiosity, but also because he's a vehicle for status and women. And then when society basically mocks and berates him again because he's humiliated because John doesn't want to be used by him anymore, then he quickly turns on John and threatens violence and revenge against him.
Yeah, and I think all of that comes about because none of them have deeper emotional ties to each other, right? So they're infantile. Like, think about how relationships go in like middle school. Like, people are literally just like blowing up on each other and switching around every 5 seconds. They don't like, right?
Even in his relationship with Helmholtz, who's probably his best friend, when it comes to the police arresting them for causing a riot at the hospital, his first thing is to turn around and blame them for it. He's like, I had nothing to do with it. It was all them.
Yeah, so like it's a world where people haven't figured out, people never learn how to be stable with each other because the rails and the soma don't require them to ever learn how to be stable with each other.
Because they're all replaceable.
Yeah. Well, and because I think it comes down to, it makes them more controllable, right? Something that's infantile can be controlled. So if they were more developed and they were more sturdy people, it would be harder to maintain the world order.
Wunkel, you said you're currently reading The Way of Zen, right?
Yeah.
So, The Way of Zen, for anybody who doesn't know, was written by Alan Watts. Alan Watts essentially brought Buddhist philosophy and Zen philosophy to the West. And he's sort of the model upon which Doctor Strange was designed, as far as I know. And that'll actually get us into talking about some of the religious topics that I wanted to get into. Did you want to just talk briefly about The Way of Zen?
Oh, yeah, sure. So what's interesting about it is that the philosophy it's paired up against in China is it's Zen versus Confucianism, and Confucianism is the conventionalism or like the conservatism and the pragmatism of like the Chinese state in essence. So it's like the conservative path through life. So it's like you take your role, you have your job, you do what you're supposed to, and then that's the path to happiness. Whereas Zen is about like deprogramming yourself and not trying to consciously figure things out. It's about running off of intuition. And what's interesting about that is it seems like the characters in the story, like John, would really benefit from that. Even Bernard and even Helmholtz. It's like when you have to exist inside of a system you can't control, your only option is to not worry about it. But Bernard worries about it so much he turns into a boomer or a doomer, and John worries about it so much that he starts like attacking himself and other people. So it's like the dude from Big Lebowski is what Zen is. Yeah.
The dude abides.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Zen is also about presence and being in the moment and experiencing life as it comes, sort of Eckhart Tolle style philosophy before
Yeah.
Eckhart Tolle. It's also a very Taoist concept.
Yeah, I
Taoism
think
is,
it's literally, I think it's literally connected to Taoism because in the book he keeps bringing up the.
yeah, and I think Alan Watts also wrote a book, if I recall correctly, called Christ, the Eternal Tao. So Taoism is essentially nothingness. It's being content with emptiness and emptying your mind of thoughts and worries and anxieties and fears. Sort of the aspirational goal of pretty much all religions to, like I was saying before, to be at one with the universe and with God.
No, yeah, and Tao is really interesting because it is sort of that philosophy's version of God, but it's literally defined as like the
Not quite.
right? It
There is still
literally,
a concept of God in Tao.
oh, there is.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact passage off the top of my head, but I have studied Taoism a little bit. So there's a line about how the Tao is older than God itself, and that it created God.
Oh, that's weird.
Essentially saying that God, i.e., the singularity, the one, came from nothing.
Okay, well, so yeah, I think the Tao is called the Way of Life. So then I guess by their suspicion, God is a part of the Way of Life, basically.
So when Mond has this conversation with John, he actually says that he believes that God does exist, but that God manifests himself differently to different people, and that currently society has no need for God, and so God manifests itself as absence. And so that, to me, actually is very in keeping with Taoist philosophy. You know, the idea that you're trying to get as close to nothingness as possible and being open and available and malleable to be anything rather than being conditioned into one specific thing. To put it as Bruce Lee said, you know, be like water. You want to flow, you want to change, you want to be adaptable to whatever situation that you're put in. So like we were talking about bottles before, water adapts to the shape of whatever bottle that it's put in. Similarly, human beings adapt to whatever situation they're put in.
Yeah, but the interesting thing about the Brave New World is that it's enforcing it on people rather than like encouraging people to like to accept it onto themselves. Yeah.
Well, much like what you were saying, Taoism is sort of the opposite of the Brave New World. Taoism is about being open and available to everyone and everything. There's a line in the Tao Te Ching, for instance, that says something to the effect of, you know, be like the block of wood before it gets sculpted, you know, be like the clay before it gets molded into something. It's an emphasis on potential rather than actual implementation.
Well, and what's interesting about that is that it's very much like, how do you avoid the anxiety inherent in that position? It's kind of weird because, so apparently the Western thought increases anxiety, but isn't being unformed and having no form kind of a more anxious position?
Well, it doesn't say that you can't have knowledge. It just says that. So there's I think it's from Buddhism. There's the parable of good and bad. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't.
So the parable of good and bad essentially goes like this. You know, there was a farmer who had a horse, and the horse got away one day, and the people said, "Oh, how terrible!" And the farmer said, "You know, we'll see." And then later the horse comes back, and it brings three other horses with it, and the people say, "Oh, how wonderful!" And the farmer says, "We'll see." And then he gives one of the new horses to his son to ride, and the son falls off and breaks his leg, and the people say, "Oh, how terrible!" And the farmer says, "We'll see." And then later, the military comes by conscripting young men, but they can't take the boy because his leg is broken. So the people say, "Oh, how wonderful." And the farmer says, "We'll see." Or in different tellings of it, instead of saying, "We'll see," he says, you know, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And so it's a lot like that, where even though things happen and you're aware of things and you have knowledge of things, you leave yourself open to different interpretations of what those things actually mean.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because yeah, I think like the idea of Zen is that it said something like, money comes into their life, but they don't know why, and then the money leaves their life and they don't know why.
Yeah, ebb and flow of everything.
Yeah.
It's also part of it is that our interpretations and our moral judgments of things are conditioned by our experiences. So, for instance, John, when he was living in the Savage Reservation, was told by Linda of the other world, and it's basically a description of heaven. But then he finally gets there, and it's the complete opposite of that. You know, he sees it for what it is, and to him, it's nothing but hell. In many ways, it's actually worse than what he thought was hell before that, in living under oppression and cruelty and abuse and prejudice by the other Indians and by Pope.
Yeah, and I think that's, Linda describes it like that because it's just the place that she finds comfort in. It's the place that she's raised to be in.
Well, she's also coming at it from the opposite experience. You know, she grew up in civilization where everything was fine. And then instead of going to what she thought was heaven, she goes to what she thought was hell. And then while she's in hell, she sort of has somewhat of a change of heart, wherein, you know, she comes to love and accept in her own way both Pope and John, even though everything in her is conditioned to override those sort of maternal instincts and those human instincts to bond and be to be pairing with a single person.
Yeah, it's like, she definitely. So in both women in the story, in Linda and in Lenina, we find like the monogamy kind of like breaking out of them, breaking out of the conditioning. So it's like the story very much believes that that is like the inherent nature of people.
Dracky, did you have anything you want to add on that point?
Not really. It just kind of, in a weird way, it kind of plays into how people want possessions. So it's kind of like they want to, in the like an unconditioned world, they very much want to be like possessing the love of their loved ones.
Sort of a very materialistic love and a very jealous love, rather than. Go ahead.
Yeah, kind of like the part when Linda first got to the reserve, and all the women basically locked themselves in her house and were beating her.
Yeah, because Linda had been conditioned that everybody belongs to everybody and that they were encouraged to be promiscuous, whereas the women in the Savage Reservation were the exact opposite of that. They had been conditioned by their own social customs to value chastity and modesty and monogamy, and also to some degree, personal property as well.
Yeah. So
Did you have any? Go ahead.
yeah. So that also kind of like plays into the the new world controller world, where it's like nobody is want for anything.
Okay. Did you have any other thoughts on religious themes within Brave New World?
Yeah. So when Mustafa was talking about the how the expressions of God changed, that very much made me think of Neil Gaiman and his writings,
Go on.
particularly with the old gods and the new gods, and it's also as a kind of auxiliary is very similar to how Terry Pratchett portrays his gods as well. Is they change with the believers.
There was there was actually a line in there that Mond brought up. Let me see if I can bring it up. But elaborate on what you were talking about with the old gods and Terry.
Yeah, so it's so they brought up that there was the way that the gods expressed themselves through Christianity back in the old days, and now they would have expressed themselves in a new way. So I'm kind of thinking they've they've actually traded for the new gods, which would be through Fordism, like through their fake easy science and their new ways of sports, and I guess automation in general.
So sort of like in Game of Thrones, how they have the old gods and the new.
Or even in American gods, for instance, with the world and media and the new ones taking over.
Or even in history as well, you had various pagan religions were taken over by Christianity, and a lot of Christian doctrine was overlaid on top of those same traditions and beliefs and gave it a new spin. And then, like you were saying, Christianity in Brave New World gets replaced by Fordism as the new religion.
No, I think there's a very like the underlying idea here is that gods are not so much divine as they are like a projection of our minds. And so as a result, when the circumstances of our lives change, then we start thinking different things, and then we create different projections of what these gods are. And it's like a very well, it's viewing it in like a way that's like the complete opposite of divinity. It's more just like it's like we're storytellers, and like we're all Neil Gaiman, and that's what religions are. But then they have this weird thing where they want to pose it like it's something that's objective.
Yeah, so that's why I brought up with Terry Pratchett in one of his books, Small Gods. The basic overview is they in the world they have a really large religion, and the story is about one of the last followers of that religion, even though the original religion was still there. And it's all about this god regaining his old church, therefore getting his powers back.
Kind of like in the new Clash of the Titans movies, how the gods basically use worship and belief as a form of currency and energy to sustain themselves, and without that belief, they ultimately pass away and die.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works in the Pratchett verse.
So, in the course of their conversation, John is challenging Mond as to, why does he keep all these books locked up, and why doesn't he teach the people about God and religion? And so he's citing King Lear and talking about how the gods are just and organize things essentially in a cyclical manner, so that what goes around comes around. At Malpace, he was unhappy from excess and isolation, whereas in London, he's unhappy from a dearth of isolation, and everybody wants to be around him. And then Mond counters, saying that, humans are the ultimate interpreters of the will of the gods, essentially the instruments of their hands, or perhaps even the other way around, that the gods are tools of men and take their cue from them, sort of reinforcing that same notion that the gods are what we make of them. So if we don't give them our energy, our attention, our focus, our worship, then they cease to be, and whatever we do wind up giving that to becomes the new god.
No, and it's a very interesting thing because it's definitely a conditioning, and the more conditioning you put into it, the more meaningful or the more weight that those words gain in you. So it's like I found like in my writing, it's like when you start to like write like sacrilegious stuff, it starts to just inherently feel a lot more interesting than if you were to use your own terminology.
Can you repeat that? I missed that.
Oh, well, it's like the conditioning that comes out of the effort we put into the religion gives those words a lot of meaning. And so if you come up with your own religion today and you use your own words, it's not you, it's going to be, there's going to be less feeling inside of that than if you were to go and just use like Christian terminology. Like Christian terminology has so much conditioning in it in our lives that it's just inherently more meaningful to work with than some new words you can come up with.
Because people already have an emotional attachment to and a relationship with those ideas.
Yeah,
This is why, even though Christianity viewed paganism as ultimately heretical, they still allowed them to have a lot of their customs and just overlaid their own on top of that, because the people weren't willing to adopt Christianity, and so they needed some kind of tether to what they already believed. And so that's where we get various symbols for things like Christmas and Easter and various other holidays.
Yeah.
Funny.
Even go ahead.
Funnily enough, that's exactly the, if we can call it mechanic, that Anton LaVey used when he started the kind of like his own sect of Satanism, which eventually led to the large churches of Satanism that formed up in Hollywood a couple of years back.
Yeah, he basically took Catholicism and inverted it and flipped and mirrored everything.
Yeah, it's different sides of the same coin.
So, in one of the books that Mond has in his library is let me see if I can find it. It's The Varieties of Religious Experience, and so it talks about believe that Christianity and Buddhism are the healthiest religions, that saintly virtues can become corrupted by excess, leading to fanaticism, something that we definitely see happen in Brave New World, where all of the virtues of happiness and community and identity and stability become corrupted when taken to their logical extreme. Varieties of Religious Experience also talks about how human beings are more persuaded by irrational emotion than by scientific fact, that a believer cannot be told seemingly real experience is false through the means of logic and reason, since their attachment to it, again, is perceptual and emotional based. When I was reading through that and researching what this book was and why it was so important that it was in Mond's library, I was reminded a lot of the concept of theosophy and the theosophic movement. Theosophy literally meaning the love of wisdom. And so it's sort of the precursor to New Ageism, and talks about how there's this ancient transcendent string that runs through all world religions. And it has an emphasis on a personal relationship with God rather than an institutional one, as well as talking about reincarnation. So I thought it was very interesting that a lot of theosophical ideas made their way into Brave New World, particularly with regards to the world controller's philosophy on life.
And also how he brings up, as he makes the rules, he can also break them.
Yeah, he says that when he was growing up, he was a physicist, and he had valued truth and beauty much like Helmholtz did, and nearly got sent to an island for it when he came to realize that they weren't really making anything new, that scientific progress had been stifled deliberately, which the deliberate part was the most horrifying part to him until they brought him into the inner circle and explained the reasons why. And he says that it was like they were copying recipes out of a cookbook instead of being allowed to create new ones, but now he's the head chef and he decides what new recipes get added. And so ultimately it's up to him at this point to decide where humanity and civilization go. And so that ties back into what we were talking about before with regards to his decision to let Bernard and Helmholtz go to the island, but not John. And there's a part of me that thinks he probably wanted civilization to be destabilized. And that's why he allowed John to sort of wreak all the havoc that he did, that it was something new and interesting and exciting and real science, as it were, akin to the Cyprus Experiment or the Ireland Experiment.
I think, in all likelihood, it was more just like it was an opportunity to like push the stability of the system, to like to test the mettle of the brave new world. You know, like they need to make sure it's stable. So John's like a perfect opportunity to make sure it's actually stable.
Yeah, so he's sort of the test of its anti-fragility and whether it can really sustain that or not. So
Yeah.
this actually leads to something else that I wanted to talk about, which is the character of Darwin Bonaparte, who is an animal documentary filmmaker who, at the very end of the book, goes and tries to hunt down John when he's living alone at the lighthouse to try and see how the savage lives and, what happened to him. And he tries to capture the essence of what his life is like. And he sees him going and flagellating himself and praying and doing all manner of other strange things, suffering. And what's really interesting about his character is that not only does he just record the sights and the sounds like people in our time would create a documentary, if he just did that, it would just be another interesting movie to them. But the real subtly pernicious and interesting part is he also records the feelings that John experiences and is able to replicate them in other people. And so when he shows off his films at the Feelies, not only are they looking at him doing strange things, but they're actually experiencing it viscerally from his perspective. And this creates a whole new sensation that none of them have ever experienced before.
Well, they do have the violent passion surrogates. They get the adrenaline shots, right?
Once a month, yeah.
Yeah. So they know the feeling of pain, right? Because when you're in pain, you get the adrenaline, but it is kind of different.
Yeah, the adrenaline surrogates are more of like a drill and like maintenance to prevent them from going insane from too much pleasure. Whereas this is more like a live exercise.
Yeah.
Like this is the real deal. Like, okay, now you're actually experiencing what real suffering is like for the first time and experiencing it in all new ways that even probably their adrenaline surrogates couldn't predict because nobody else had really experienced it up until that point, except for maybe the controller or the people that left society altogether. And so this creates a new sensation and a new cult of people who are absolutely obsessed with the idea of, okay, now we want to experience more suffering as well. And they actually sexualize it too and turn it into like this giant S&M orgy at the end of the book.
Yeah, and I think that comes out of the whole like rebelling against malaise kind of thing, because all of them have very like lethargic lives, and so just like there's like all those like revolutions with Woodstock and everything, it's like they're kind of experiencing that too. There's like that sort of underlying desire to do something like crazy because your life is just so normal.
So one thing I thought was interesting about Darwin Bonaparte is his name. So in the last stream, we were talking about Bernard Marx. Now his name was a combination of Bernard Shaw and Karl Marx. In the case of this filmmaker, he's of course a combination of Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, as well as Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a conqueror of Europe. And so in a way, you can ask the question: is what he's doing by introducing this new feeling sensation? Is it conquering and overturning and subduing the world state and bringing it to its knees, or is it helping human beings evolve into something healthier?
That's like a really deep theory I've never heard before.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
No, that's actually a really good idea.
Dracky, you were saying?
yeah, it's like the only thing that kind of triggered Napoleon to Bonaparte to do the the Feely forming was the discovery from the two delivery drivers, I think they were, that
Yeah,
discovered John. But then it's pretty interesting to think what kind of structure he's following. Like, would he say, for instance, be like an alpha plus that has free reign over creating his own feelies? or if there's
Well,
some other person orchestrating it.
well, I think the alphas were the ones that were in charge of propaganda, were they not? Like Helmholtz was a propagandist.
Yeah, that's correct.
So it's very likely that he's high up in the chain, and he was probably given free pass to do all this because he was only using it on animals at that point. Whereas he probably just thought, oh, this savage is basically an animal. Let me go and try and figure out what his experience is like. Because remember when they had the 3 weeks in the helicopter film, everybody was bragging about. I don't know if this was the same guy that made it, but everybody was bragging about. Oh, they have real bearskin fur, and you can feel what it actually feels like, and that was the new sensation for everybody at that point. So he probably was thinking of it more along those lines, where it's like, oh, okay, we're gonna get to feel what this savage is like, and not realizing the broader consequences of what he did in opening Pandora's box and bringing in uh, instability to the entire civilization. Anybody that saw it.
Yeah, and I think also just going back a bit with the violent surrogates, that's also kind of left as a big mystery because it doesn't necessarily mention if it's like violence induced or if it's just like like a monthly vaccination thing that happens.
I
No,
think it's treated
it's an
more as a
injection.
vaccination. I think it's more of like a vaccination than anything because they're shot up with adrenaline to simulate fear and anxiety and anger in order that they don't become numb to an overdose of happy feelings. Because remember, all the people in this society, they can still feel all of the vast spectrum of negative emotions. They're just suppressed.
Yeah, like including a bit of stress in the life.
Yeah. Whereas if they allowed them to experience them freely, it would lead to perpetual unhappiness. But they also recognize that, if they don't at least have some of that, then they're going to become too used to it. And so it's sort of like with alcohol, for instance, if you drink a lot of it, you can build up a tolerance for it.
I think also it probably touches on such things as the Stoic way of life.
Yeah. You want to elaborate on that?
I'm not too much. I'm not too clued in on it because I'm only really going through it now. But a common vein that I can see through um, the Stoic authors would be basically living your life and taking upon the stresses and dealing with them as a path to enlightenment.
Which is sort of what John goes through at the very end of the book. Um, One thing I thought was interesting is we talk about the symbolism in Brave New World. So his environment when he's living in the lighthouse is surrounded by water and heather. And both of those are symbols of cleansing and purification. So heather plants, for instance, were used to make brooms. In Celtic lore, heather is a token of love sent by a fallen warrior. And there are two main types. So you have white, which is for protection, good luck, and wishes coming true. And then you have purple, which is for admiration and solitude. And so there are few people who ever come out here because, as we learned in the beginning of the book, a lot of them are conditioned to be repulsed by nature and flowers. And so they would rather go play golf or do other things that use up resources. And so John is basically left alone by himself to be stoic and to self-flagellate and purify himself and overcome his sins, sort of like in the way that something like Opus Dei would do, where they whip themselves and they have um, those belts that they wear around their legs that have nails and bite into them as a reminder that that pain is the price for sin.
No, yeah, and what's interesting is that Bernard invites her to a walk through the heather on their date at the
And then John literally throws Lenina into a bundle of heather at the end.
well, no, he throws himself into like a briar or something.
Yeah, I think like a bramble
Yeah.
bush or something.
Yeah. I think he beats her on the ground. I don't think he throws her into a bush.
What is that?
Or no, wait, or
There's
does she? I think what you're thinking about is that Henry hides himself in a bush or whatever. He like runs away.
no, he runs to the helicopter.
Oh yeah.
But there's that poem Scarborough Fair, which is basically a love story about somebody is asked to do a series of impossible tasks, and then only in fulfilling these impossible tasks will the person win over love and become worthy of the other person. And I don't remember the exact line. I could look it up, but one of them is binding a bundle of heather with like a strap or something. Let me look that up real quick.
Yeah, and also John talks about similar when he's trying to explain heroic acts to Lenina and why he should be deserving of their monogamy.
Yeah, because he feels unworthy and he feels the need to do some sort of dangerous or risky task to prove his worthiness of Lenina, because he views her as an angel and a goddess and perfect, whereas he's so plain and uncivilized and unworthy of her.
No, yeah. So like, what's interesting is relationships, because they're so shallow in the Brave New World, don't need such like acts of courtship or anything, because it's just not a big deal. It's just casual. But then Bernard and John, they're all about like those professions of love and like doing like the courtship stuff, because they're looking for more meaningful relationships. Yeah.
I think it's in Bernard's case, it's more like he was going for he doesn't want his partner to be as quick to swap to other people.
Well, he's looking for someone that's willing to experience like the same things as him, right? So like he like hates the fair and the wrestling tournament, and he just hates it and he thinks it's awful. And then he hates the music and he wants to just like stare at things, and he's desperate for Lenina to want to experience it with him. And then finally he just gives up and realizes that she's never gonna like those things as well.
Yeah, looking for like a partner in isolation, if as it were.
Yeah. And then he basically like gives up hope on that and just turns himself off and then takes Soma for like the first time in the book. So he just like gives in.
And then he wakes up the next morning and realizes what he wound up doing, and feels guilty and shameful about it, and winds up killing himself.
Oh, well, we're talking about Bernard, right?
Oh, I thought you were talking about John. Sorry,
No,
I
we're
stepped
talking
away for a
about yeah, we're talking about Bernard when he's first dating Lenina and they go on their date together, and then he realizes that she's never going to be interested in his weird things, so then he takes the Soma.
Yes, pretty much anybody who's feeling any negative emotion, they use that to numb the pain rather than confront it.
Yeah, but what was interesting is that he was refusing to use it for the entire time of the story up until that point.
Anyway, I found the Scarborough Fair line. It says, "Tell her to reap it with a sickle of leather and gather it all in a bunch of heather. So heather being a very sharp plant, I would assume, very stiff and bristly. But a sickle of leather obviously isn't going to cut anything, so saying that it's an impossible task. While we're on the subject of symbolism, something else that I noticed throughout the book was the recurring theme of snakes and insects.
Really? What?
Yeah, so there are a number of times when snakes are mentioned. So, for instance, snakes are used in the Malpais ceremony, the rain dance. Snakes are tossed at people among the savage reservation. The Indians, when they're dancing, are described as moving snakily. The director, when John and Linda come back to civilization, he's referred to as a snake. The reporters that hound John at the end of the book, one of them sneaks up on him using his pneumatic shoes, and John refers to it as him coming up to him, startled as though by the bite of a snake. John's spirit animal is the eagle, and eagles are known for being predators of snakes. And then there's also what we were talking about last time, the idea of, slaying the dragon just being a giant serpent, as well as the snake of the Garden of Eden, who is the father of temptation, and how that parallels with John's temptations with Lenina, how the woman is the one that ultimately tempts him to eat of the poison fruit, which I guess in this case would be Soma. And then also I was thinking about Jordan Peterson among his lectures talks about how human beings have a very archetypical view of snakes, and that they often occur as villains and demons within religion and pop culture because we evolved alongside them and they're predators and we need to be constantly on guard against them, and how that plays into the whole idea that the world state is a very fragile society. So snakes occur as a common theme throughout the book. And then John is usually the one that, either John or Bernard are the ones that are having to deal with the snakes and overcome that.
Or in Bernard's case, bringing the snakes into society to get out of exile.
Yes, letting the snakes into the garden, as it were. And then that winds up undoing paradise. Because ultimately, like we were talking about with Darwin Bonaparte, John becomes the undoing of society when society is allowed to experience instability and suffering.
Oh yeah, so it's like a thing of like he's giving them the knowledge of good and evil, and you can't go back.
And then insects are also a common theme in there. You have the flies that are buzzing around at Malpais. The children who constantly harass John are referred to as insects. The helicopters that come after him, they're described as like locusts they came. In chapter 18, he says, as flies to wanton boys, we are, chapter 17, he says, as flies to wanton boys, we are to the gods. They kill us for their sport. The crowds that mob John are referred to as insects. There's a constant talk about pestilence and poison. John describes civilization and his own wickedness as poisons that he must purify himself of.
So I think the use of the snakes and the insects is because a lot of people have aversions to those things, and this book is all about negative relationships with the world. So in order to make you feel more, or I guess to make their negative feelings or their negative relationship towards the world more apparent, they're bringing up those negative whatchamacallit, imagery of like snakes and insects and stuff that usually freak people out.
And snakes are also poisonous as well. So the combination of those two symbols would be fear and disgust of disease and poison. Poison in this case being an excess of virtue and of pleasurable vices.
Yeah, and I think snakes and insects, they're also generally considered to be like pretty thoughtless, like they don't have any brains.
They pretty much just consume endlessly as well, like locust.
Yeah. So it's like it's sort of like the negative way of portraying what these people are, right? Because they have no control and they're infantile, they're not respectably intelligent or whatever. Yeah.
To a lesser extent, you also see imagery of carcasses around as well, like the dog carcasses when they go to the savage reservation. And of course, carcasses bring vultures and flies and pestilence and disease as well. Whereas civilization has done everything that they can to try and ward off pestilence and disease and death. But in so doing, go ahead.
I think Mustafa even talks about eliminating mosquitoes, I think it was.
Yes. So they don't even have to deal with things like mosquito-borne diseases. So going back to the idea of the serpent, so when John is at the savage reservation, he worships the old gods and the new, the old gods being the pagan gods of like the Hopi tribes, and the new gods being Christianity with Jesus and Mary. And so there's a lot of themes of resurrection as well. And so Christ is generally seen as the foil to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. You can think of like John Milton's Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, wherein the serpent tempts woman and man and they're cast out of paradise, but then Christ the Redeemer comes and through his own humbling and self-sacrifice and torture and ultimately his death, he winds up saving the rest of humanity who follows him. And in a similar way, John goes through a sort of and actually practicing sort of a mock crucifixion where he holds his hands out to the side as long as he can and actually prays to God and Jesus. And then through his death and suffering, by way of the Feelies, the rest of society is sort of liberated from the slavery of an excess of pleasurable virtues and vices.
That's interesting because I don't know. My understanding of my interpretation of the ending has always been that the world just goes on. The Brave New World just keeps being the Brave New World. But like, you're definitely like making the argument for why it might not be like.
So, in as much as he tried to cure himself of poison, he became a poison pill of sorts for civilization.
No, yeah, I can see that. Although it's just like the reaction, like literally the very end, is the people walk into the lighthouse looking for him, and then he's dead. It's like that could technically be the end of it right there, right? Because the way that these people react to death is that they just move on. So do you think that John would actually, his image or his presence would be capable of living on beyond his death?
Well, much like how society wound up coming to worship Henry Ford, and like I was saying, the people that were after John sort of had a cult-like mentality to them in that they were begging to be whipped and they wanted to see him perform. And so I could definitely see sort of a fringe cult forming up around him, at least among the people that partook of the feelies of him. And so maybe part of their induction ceremony might be to have them go and watch that film that Darwin Bonaparte made. And then once they wind up feeling suffering, then they try to inflict that on other people.
But the thing is, like, all right, so look at China. Like, what does China? So China does not allow religion in their country, and what do? They put people in conditioning camps if they get sick with religion. So wouldn't the Brave New World do the same?
Probably, but I think to some extent it would become out of their control, because we don't actually know how many people wound up experiencing that film. It could be more than people let on. It could be more than they're able to control without somebody waking up and realizing, oh shit, they're suddenly getting rid of hundreds of people. And just that alone, their reaction to it, the cure could be worse than the disease in many ways. Because people turn around and all of a sudden they have to replace entire Volkanovsky groups. And that in itself creates instability and costs resources.
True, but I don't know. My suspicion
Because
is
what are they
that
going to... Go ahead.
well, my suspicion is that their interest in John was fairly shallow. So it's a situation of like, it's the latest feeling, it's the hot thing. Like, look at the way people, the trends hit Instagram stuff. Like where I live, there's this thing called the super bloom. And it's like once a year, some flowers on a hillside blossom, and literally just like thousands of people flock to it. And I don't know if it's necessarily a very deep thing.
Well, over here in New England, we have the leafers who go up to like Vermont and stuff to look at the leaves every fall when they change color. But stuff like that it's a very shallow sensation and very geared towards aesthetics. Whereas this is introducing like deep emotional suffering and negativity and churning up all manner of experiences that prior to this they had never even been aware of. So I think this is going to be something that ultimately lasts, at least among the people that come in contact with it. Like Bernard and Helmholtz and Lenina, and even Mond to some extent, are probably permanently changed by their encounter with John. So like all of the deltas and the people at the party who already just had this very shallow, carny-like relationship with John, viewing him as basically nothing more than, you know, an ape doing tricks. Like those people, they would have more of a shallow, fleeting relationship. But the people that actually experienced it for themselves, it's sort of like a mystic experience in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
There's actually a pretty good parallel with the part at the end with the group that comes to John after the Feelies, with the solidarity services. And I think Huxley actually wanted to draw on that, with them reciting from the, I guess you could call it hymn.
Yeah, because like I was saying before, the solidarity services are more of like a death cult in many ways, in that they're killing off the self and individuality to become one with the greater whole. If you could imagine there being a parallel cult rising up and following John, wherein they're doing the exact opposite of that. They're killing off their connection to the collective in favor of individualism, or perhaps even killing people in a literal sense.
Well, yeah, because it's interesting. This is like a world where people never like consider like killing each other, right? Like I don't think there's really any reason for people to ever get to the point of emotions or anger that deep.
Yeah, apart from the adrenaline surrogate, they're never in want of anything. They're never denied anything. They never, aside from Bernard, who's an aberration, they never feel jealousy or a desire towards violence. The only violence that they ever get is what's seen in the feelies like 3 weeks in a helicopter. Even when the police come and put down a riot, they're not beating them over the heads with batons, they're gassing them with soma. And they're using hypnopedic suggestions in order to calm them down.
Yeah, it's almost like the world state recognizes that that pain and like painful experiences are like very hard to condition. So you want to, or yeah, it's very hard to change the conditioning of those things. So they avoid creating those events as much as possible to keep the world stable.
Because pain tells a creature where it's vulnerable, and everything about their society is geared towards happiness. And pain is sort of the antithesis of happiness. And so if they're allowed to experience pain because of its deep-rooted connection to our sense of survival, that would threaten stability more than anything. And so they do everything they can to try and abate pain.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So I'm just busy looking through my notes here, and with the director notes there that he had taken his trip 20 years before. So all in all, like, we could probably say that John is between like 16 to 18 years old, which is actually like pretty sad when you see what he's putting up with here.
And also the fact that at least an unconditioned teenager would be quite hormonal, particularly if he comes from an abusive family. And so he'll be even more predisposed towards violence than somebody who grew up in a loving monogamous family.
Yeah, it actually explains the bit where John broke into the apartment at the reserve right in the beginning, and how he acted with Lenin's clothing.
Well, that's like, that's like the first moment you ever like find out about that stuff, right? Because like he'd been like hidden from it his entire life, and then finally it was like his first time in front of it.
Yeah, it's painting quite a different picture in my mind now after seeing that than when I was first listening to it on the audiobook.
Going back to, just to tie off this bit about John and the cult following. So one of the books that Mond has, we were talking the varieties of religious experience. One of the lectures that James Williams talks about is that of mysticism. And so he claims that in order for something to constitute a mystical experience, there are 4 key markers. The first is ineffability. Basically, there's no adequate way to report its contents in words. It's something that has to be directly experienced and can't be imparted or transferred to others. That definitely describes sort of the pain sensation that not just the people in the book, but all human beings go through. Like, a child learns better from experiencing putting its hand on a hot stove than it ever could by you telling it what the concept of hot and pain are. And once you put its hand to the hot stove, it's forever changed. It's going to learn that.
Like Jordan Peterson says, let your kid skateboard.
Or like even in the beginning where they're conditioning the infants, the only pain that they ever feel is against things that the society doesn't want them to feel, like the lower castes reading books or being out and about among flowers. They're given electric shocks, and that's the only other form of pain that they've ever known. But then that's suppressed underneath all of the positive emotions and conditioning. And that's not something that you can convey to somebody, at least not as clearly as you could through direct personal experience. So the second of the 4 qualities that Williams says makes up a mystical experience is noetic quality, Noetic. It says, although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seem to those who experience them to also be states of knowledge. They are states of insight into depths of truth unplumbed by the discursive intellect. They are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance, all inarticulate though they remain, and as a rule they carry with them a curious sense of authority for after time. So we can think about this with regards to, say, how John imprinted on people like Helmholtz in reading Shakespeare to him and introducing the concept of poetry, whereas before he was just writing jingles. And so he actually got something deeper out of that.
No, yeah, he was saying he wanted to find words that could pierce people or whatever.
So whereas ineffability is something that can only be directly experienced, noetic quality could also be imparted verbally. So we think of divine revelation, for instance, with like angels or gods dictating their commands to mankind. The other two aspects of mystical experience are transiency. Mystical states cannot be sustained for long. And then passivity. The mystic feels as if his own will were in abeyance, and indeed sometimes as if he were grasped and held by superior power. So all four of those things I definitely think would qualify in saying that the suffering and pain that the people felt in the feelies is definitely a mystical experience. And usually when people have a mystical experience, again, it's something irrational and emotional and perceptual that they cling to, and no amount of science or reasoning or logic can persuade them away from it. So again, I do think that even though the experience itself was transient, it's going to have a permanent impact on society as a whole going forward.
No, yeah. You know what's really funny is this is reminding me of Avatar, the freaking James Cameron movie, because you remember those articles back when it came out from the people who didn't want to leave the movie and they felt like they needed to live there or whatever.
Hell, I would love to go live on Pandora.
But it's like people that were literally they were like feeling depressed after leaving the movie because they didn't want to leave. And it made me think that it's almost like the films are being turned into a mystic experience in a way, and we don't want it to be transient, we want it to stay.
And even though you go and rewatch the movie, it's never quite the same.
My first thoughts after watching the movie was, first it was like, wow, that was pretty high budget. I think it was also the very first 3D movie I watched in the cinemas. And then second thoughts is, I just watched Pocahontas again.
Or Dances with Wolves, or Fern Gully.
Yeah, I don't so many people I talk to express this perspective of you can't repeat a concept, and if it's repeated it's like dumb or whatever. But like the reality of being human beings, that we all live pretty similar lives, so it's like you have to accept that things are going to get recovered, and it's totally okay to do that.
And people generally embrace the sequelitis.
Well, all right, so that's where I think we hit like a brick wall, because it's do you think it's a valid remake or a phoned in remake? Because I would argue it's definitely a valid like spiritual remastering. It's not cash grab. I don't think at all.
Well, even though the plot is basically a ripoff of other tales, you know, like you were saying before, people didn't want to leave the theater because they had essentially a religious experience in watching it. So it was clearly something more than just the plot. It was something in the holistic experience, probably a lot of it having to do with the visuals and the music and the emotional connection and the fact that it was in 3D. Imagine if it was in VR with haptic feedback, it'd be even more so. Like you would want to live there, and you'd be essentially like Ready Player One, where people spend their entire lives living in the virtual world rather than in the real world because it's just better there.
Well, it's
No,
kind
yeah,
of kind of
and
like when I went to go watch Star Wars Episode 3. We had a movie theater that had like this. I can't remember what the tech was called, but they kind of recreated the environments of the movies inside the movie house. So it's like the part when they were fighting on Mustafar. It's like the entire theater basically like smelt like lava. That was pretty immersive.
Just imagine if it had feely capability as well. You'd really feel the heat from the lava.
Or the feeling of losing 3 limbs.
Oh God, that would be terrible.
no, and the reason that's so dangerous is because it's allowing you to emotionally attach at like a very deep level to something that's not your life, and now you have to go back to your life where everything's boring and whatever. So it's like it's the more convincing those things become, the more of a the more depressing it is coming back from them.
Well, people are persuaded by contrast. So they're contrasting what they're experiencing in the real world with what they experience in the virtual world or the film world or a religious experience. So, like, I had started talking about this last time, but brushed it aside because I felt it was off topic. But since we're on the subject of religious experience at this point, uh, the story about The Nightmare Before Christmas is essentially about a guy who, much like Helmholtz, is at the peak of his game and is bored and uninterested with what he has come to see as ordinary life. So he goes off into the unknown and faces uh, a new world unlike anything he's ever seen. And it's a religious experience because he can't describe it. It's something that can only be understood through direct experience. In this case, being the spirit of Christmas and that sense of joy and wonder that he feels like every child does. And then he tries to bring it back and convey it, and everybody thinks it's queer and uh, interesting, but also bizarre, and they can't quite replicate it the way that he was able to do. And eventually they wind up corrupting it in the way that so many other religious traditions do.
No, yeah, that's interesting. So, are you saying that in a way, like John? So what John was trying to make the world understand isn't necessarily the message they're going to take away from it.
Yeah, they're going to pervert it into something dark and violent, probably closer to, actually, in many ways, I would say probably worse than the Savage Reservation and the Indians there, because even though they were violent and prejudicial, they at least had, they were used to those conditions and had developed a sort of case-selected society and a system of morals and ethical behaviors and traditions around that. Whereas these people who would be part of this death cult um, would just be completely unhinged and they wouldn't have any sort of leadership to guide them. So they would be flying blind and it would become perverted and violent and destructive. And they would just completely destroy all of the good things about the world state society as well as the bad. So it would overshoot the mark.
No, yeah. So, oof, yeah, like I don't know. My impression of the book had always been that it just sort of like putters out and goes along normally, but I guess it could definitely like go in a weird direction if you took that.
Going back to the topic of reusing stuff, as an author, I understand that you're going to be you have to ground what you are creating, even if it's something new. You have to ground it into something that people can already understand and accept and relate to. You know, this is where things like the hero's tale and the notion of archetypes comes in, and how there's only so many stories. Even Brave New World, as groundbreaking and prescient as it was still grounded largely in things like the works of Shakespeare, the works of Bernard Shaw, the various books that Mond keeps in his vault. I actually went through and looked up pretty much all of the references that Huxley uses, pretty much all of the references to Shakespeare that Huxley uses through John come from only a handful of his plays. So you have Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, The Tempest, and then you also have a poem of his called The Phoenix and the Turtle. So The Phoenix and the Turtle is it's a love story about a phoenix and a turtle dove. Let me see if I can pull that up real quick. Yeah, it's regarded as the first great published metaphysical poem, and is an allegory about the death of ideal love. And then Phoenix, of course, being a symbol of resurrection, like what we were talking about before, with regards to John being like a Christ-like figure and embodying the hero. And then let me see if I can find the exact. Essentially, the love between the phoenix and the turtle dove is taboo, but it's also something admirable and noble, so much so that nature itself winds up writing a eulogy for the two of them.
This sounds like a really like a meta version of Romeo and Juliet.
In many ways, it kind of is, which I think is why Huxley included it in the book, because he tries to have John and Lenina parallel Romeo and Juliet, and in fact, John himself seems to think of himself as Romeo, and the only language that he can use to understand how he feels for Lenina is to cast her as Juliet. However, so I've actually seen most of these. I'd seen Othello, I'd seen Hamlet, I'd seen King Lear. I hadn't actually seen The Tempest prior to reading this, which The Tempest is where the line Brave New World comes from. And actually, John recites The Tempest probably more than all of the others, I would say. So actually, last night went and watched the 2010 version of it. And having seen it, I can actually say that besides just the lines that they use, a lot of the structural framework of that play is evident in Brave New World. And I would go so far as to say that the relationship between John and Lenina is probably more reflective of that of Miranda and Ferdinand than it is of Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if you guys have ever seen or read The Tempest.
No, I haven't.
Saw the play like forever ago for school, but I can't actually remember much from it.
So The Tempest is thought to be one of Shakespeare's last plays that he ever wrote. After the first scene, which takes place on a ship at sea during a tempest, the rest of the story is set on a remote island where the sorcerer Prospero, a complex and contradictory character, lives with his daughter Miranda and his two servants, Caliban, a savage monster figure, and Ariel, an airy spirit. The play contains music and songs that evoke the spirit of enchantment on the island and implores many themes, including magic, betrayal, revenge, and family. In Act 4, a wedding mask serves as a play within the play and contributes spectacle, allegory, and elevated language. So the version I watched was sort of a gender swap of Prospero with Helen Mirren. And then Miranda was played by Felicity Jones, who pretty much everything I've ever seen her in, she's just absolutely amazing, and this was no exception. And then Russell Brand is in it as well. But I can see why John was particularly drawn to The Tempest, because it has that sort of magical, mystical, religious quality to it, where the gods literally come down and bless Miranda and Ferdinand's wedding, and the sorcerer Prospero summons demons to go and slay his enemies, and it's just really cool, and the effects in the 2010 version are really well done. And so you can really see it's disheartening that a place like the world state doesn't have any of that. And it's just devoid of art and beauty like that, and of religion and mysticism.
Well, yeah, and he says that, I mean, Mustafa Mann says this because beauty of old things does not promote stability and happiness necessarily.
Talking about the way that authors rip off of prior works. So another central theme of Brave New World is the idea of soma being used as a drug. And its parallel in the Savage Reservation is alcoholism. And in The Tempest, the main villains are essentially a bunch of drunk servants who convince the one monstrous demon that they're going to get together and rise up and overthrow and kill Prospero and take his crown and rule the island. So even that part is sort of reflected in Brave New World in regards to the corrupting influence of soma into every way of life, and how it overthrows the more noble aspects of human endeavor. And Mond even says that, because there is no suffering in life, there is no suffering or insecurity in the world state, there is no need for heroism, courage, or nobility. And yet the inciting incident in The Tempest is a tragic storm.
Well, yeah, it seems like everything about this book and everything about most authors is based off of works of influence. So when I was reading this, I was thinking that I think Aldous Huxley had a lot of knowledge of Buddhist concepts and stuff that enabled him to write this story like this, because it seems like he puts it in direct contrast to these principles of enlightenment.
It's interesting because Alan Watts, although he lived around the same time as Huxley, didn't write The Way of Zen until after Huxley had already written Brave New World. So he couldn't have gotten it from that source. So it's curious as to what source he did get it from. Like I was saying before, I do think he was very well aware of things like Blavatsky's Theosophical movement. He's also very well versed in things like Christianity. There was also the Varieties of Religious Experience, which talks about Buddhism. So he probably got it from there, would be my guess.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just check how we're doing on time here. So while we're on the subject of soma, one thing that I had contemplated throughout all of it is they're taught to value consumption, and there obviously is money in society, but we're never really told what kind of money that is. So I was wondering if soma itself is used as a form of currency, because it certainly seems that way. You think about the scene with the deltas, where they line up after work to basically get their paycheck, which is in the form of soma tablets. And then they rush, not only because of the chemical addiction to soma, but probably also because it's used to sustain their livelihood maybe as a barter good.
I doubt that they're bartering it just because. Well, I mean, they do point out like the chewing gum, freaking whatchamacallit. Benito Hoover gives Bernard some chewing gum in order to like get in with John to one of the parties, right?
Yeah, but it's never actually expressly stated what they use for money. Like, we could assume it's either not important or it's some sort of variant of the pound since it takes place in the UK, or maybe they have some sort of global currency. I know crypto wasn't even a concept at the time yet.
Not even
Yeah,
computers.
Or computers, yeah. Actually, this was even prior to FDR's gold seizure of 1933. So back then, they were still using gold and silver backed notes for the majority of financial transactions. Anyway, that was just a thought I had as to whether Soma itself could be a form of money, considering that they seem to use it that way in many respects. Let me just see what else I have in my talking points list. So one of the philosophers that Mon talks about is this guy by the name of De Buren. And one of the lines that he quotes is, "We are God's property." And so when I read that, my first thought was hearkening back to when we were studying law and we were taught sort of the spiritual economics filter of life, which basically is as above, so below. So just as we use currency and economic principles in physical transactions, in the spiritual realm, you have an equivalent of that in the form of karma or good deeds and bad deeds and things of that nature. And our teachers had emphasized in us that we were to be stewards of the earth, and that, much like what we were talking about before, how the gods are whatever it is that we make of them, in a way, we're also the tools of their will. So their will is expressed through us, and even to some extent, probably can only be expressed through us. And so each of us has the power and ability to interpret the will of the gods and the will of God through a direct connection with the transcendent. But then we also have a corresponding moral duty to preserve and take care of God's creation and what we have here in the service of ourselves and also of mankind. So I thought that was very interesting that he would have that as one of his guiding principles.
No, so you mentioned karma. That was something really interesting that I came across when I read The Way of Zen, because it was talking about how the two poles in the cycle of suffering are the aesthetic and the sensual, and it's like angels and demons. So what's interesting is that in terms of defining bad and good actions, technically good actions can create karma, and an enlightened person is a person who does not who does not buy into either aesthetics or sensual things. He's literally like deleted himself from good and evil.
Or, as I often say, nature itself is amoral, not immoral or moral. That it really doesn't care about good or bad. It works on a strictly will to power basis, a sort of Nietzschean amorality. That all
Yeah.
that matters is whether you can, and then questions of whether you should are down to your personal preference and whether you're able to enforce your will upon the world.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that like a truly enlightened person isn't obsessed with good actions. Like that's literally like not even on their brain.
And in Taoist philosophy in general, Taoism is not concerned with good or evil either. It's just concerned with being itself.
Yeah, because it talks about how there's an inherent trust in human intuition, and all of these conscious thoughts about good and evil get in the way of that intuition.
Trying to see what else I have on the list here before we end this.
Just busy taking a look at an article on the economy, and it says it operates on a command economy in which prices, production, and trade are all regulated by the state. So it doesn't actually mention any form of currency or anything in the book.
Interesting. I wonder if they use, since we were talking about China, they have the social credit system. And given that we're tending more towards being in a social media online world, and how reputation is becoming a form of currency and attention is becoming a form of currency, I wonder if they use something closer to that as opposed to an actual physical commodity for currency.
One thing that strikes me as pretty interesting is they do mention the giving of gifts in the book as well.
Yeah, and then the people at the end of the book, they, in a very crude and crass way, are offering gifts to John as well in the forms of things like peanuts and chewing gum, if they're not outright throwing them at him. So one of the main themes of Brave New World is talking about the idea of freedom versus conformity. And so as it happened, I had caught the iRobot movie last night, and I was noticing a lot of similar themes between that and Brave New World as well, where you have Vicky, who is the supreme central command of all the robots, and her bastardized, corrupted interpretation of the three laws essentially declared that human beings are infantile children incapable of taking care of themselves, and so takes it upon herself to then impose essentially an authoritarian state controlling all of them and restricting their movements, apart from what ostensibly she would decide is the best course of action to ensure their stability and their survival. And she even cites things like war and violence and crime as being her justification for declaring human beings essentially incompetent to take care of their own selves. And I thought that seemed to parallel a lot with Mustafa Man's rationale for deciding to maintain the world state, even though he's aware of what it does.
No, yeah, well, and that's a very big trope in pretty much most science fiction, is that it always ends up making these grand statements about how is humanity inherently destructive or inherently good, and do we need to put a clamp on them? Like I think the James Cameron movie The Abyss, that's like the final showdown, is that he goes down and he talks to the alien about humanity, whether they're worthy of living or not. It's like that's just like, yeah, it's a big trope in science fiction.
And in The Matrix, you have Agent Smith. Essentially, his assessment of humanity is that we are a virus and they are the cure. And then we were talking about Star Trek last time. So Picard is constantly tested by, I forget what the character's name is. It's like V or something.
Q.
Q, yes. So Q is basically this godly figure who can transcend space and time, and he essentially puts humanity through a series of trials by way of Picard, essentially judging them unworthy of even existing.
Although in Star Trek, he's part of the Q Collective, which is essentially his entire race does the same thing. Although that particular Q has an interest in humans, and I think it's both Picard and Captain Janeway who both deal with him.
And much like Q is part of a collective, Mustafa Mond is the only world controller we see, but in the book, he's actually only world controller for Western Europe. There are actually 11 of them in all.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that the world controllers are literally like the opposite of Q, because Q is an intensely idealistic person, but all of the world controllers are like intensely pragmatic.
Well, at least from Mustafa Mond, and if the others are anything like him, we get the sense that Mond himself is very idealistic in the sense that he values truth and beauty the same way that Helmholtz and Bernard and John do, just that he's resigned himself to the fact that he has a duty to forgo his own happiness and his own desire and fulfillment of that ideal for the sake of ensuring the happiness of the rest of the people under his charge. Going back to what I was saying before about how we are stewards of the earth.
Mm-hmm. But the thing, I think, like the point that this story is making is the fact that the desire to control things comes from idealism, and you can see that the end result of trying to control things is that things get really difficult and unmanageable and overbearing. So it's almost like, yes, we have this inherent tendency to want to be idealistic, but does that cause good things?
The best laid plans of mice and men all come to naught. Who knows what's good or bad?
Yeah, and like all of John is idealism, right? Because he's running off of like Shakespeare, and he has this ideal of what his pursuit of romance should be, and then it goes terribly wrong and he just explodes.
I do think it would be interesting to see what would happen if John had actually read any of the religious texts that Mon had offered him, even if he was just reading the Bible. So when we were studying law, one of my teachers had noted, I forget which famous legal scholar it was, but he had gone across the entire country to all the various parts of like the Midwest and so forth. And he was saying that he was fully confident that this country understood the law because in every household he found a copy of William Shakespeare and the Bible on every mantle. And I thought it was interesting that those are two of the main books that guide Mond as well. And he's the one in charge of setting all the laws for society.
Well, because I would say that the Bible is like the conventional ideals of society, and then Shakespeare's like the romantic ideal, or like the emotional ideals of society in a way. They're both very conventional.
One of my favorite Shakespeare pieces actually doesn't even, it barely even gets mentioned. I think it gets one single line in all of Brave New World, which is unfortunate. But my favorite is actually The Merchant of Venice. And one of my favorite scenes in the entire thing is the courtroom scene, in which they're talking about essentially the difference between Old Testament law, which is very strict and rigid and to the letter, versus New Testament law, which is much more forgiving and equitable and more about the spirit of the law. And in a similar fashion, we also see the relationship between John and Mond, where Mond is a moral relativist, whereas John is more of, I don't want to use the term objectivist because that has a very specific reference to Ayn Rand, but he believes in an objective morality of sorts. Things like chastity and honor, duty, loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
Tying off what I was talking about before with regards to iRobot. So we had discussed in the last session of this that iRobot was written after Huxley, and how Huxley had no idea about the way in which robotics would influence this. Yet we as a society are actually going to have to contend with this, where we have a Brave New World scenario that is sort of intersected with things like the Matrix, like iRobot, like Ready Player One and Transcendence and all the other things that we've been talking about that have been added since the time of Huxley. And we're going to have to try and figure out a way to navigate a solution of our own. So, do you guys have any thoughts, having read the entire book at this point, as to how we come about a solution and how we find some sort of middle ground between the savage reservation and the world state?
I mean, you can look at politicians and just and so they literally talk about protectionism in this story, right? They talk about how they don't want efficiency improvements because that would reduce the number of jobs. So in a way, they're basically protecting the employment of the human population. They're refusing to cut down jobs. So that seems to be like the middle ground that I think politics will arrive at, probably, is that they're just going to say these jobs have to exist and we're not going to reduce them or allow them to go away.
I think for me, the middle ground is more territory, because one of the things is AI and automation and scientific improvement leads to greater efficiency, which, if we were to stick on just one planet and not do anything, then it kind of would lead to the situation that would lead up to Brave New World. However, a lot of that gets mitigated if we actually just leave the crash.
I think there are sort of issues with both of those. For one thing, having the protectionism in place is sort of unsustainable in the long run. Like we were talking last time about how you have this philanthropic individual who basically pays people to dig ditches and fill them in again just because he derives pleasure out of it, or is doing it out of a sense of duty of treating these glorified pets, as it were.
Yeah, but it comes down to, like, do you want to have riots or do you want to give people crappy jobs?
Yeah,
and I think giving them crappy jobs over riots.
I definitely agree, but here's the problem. Eventually the money will run out, right? So, like, we don't expect pets to really do anything to work for the love and care that we give them, right? We just feed them because we have an obligation to. We don't expect children to do that. But at the same time, pets and children cost money and resources. And if realistically, if you don't have the resources to sustain them, then it's not particularly wise to have them in the first place. And so obviously, if you have them already, you can't just go and undo that. But long term, it's going to, like I was talking about in the last session, people are going to voluntarily stop having kids because they're going to wake up and realize that we can't sustain all of these people. We can barely sustain all the alphas, but then as we saw with the Cyprus Experiment, having nothing but artists and scientists isn't going to work either, because eventually somebody is going to be on the bottom rung, and you're still going to have class warfare. You're still going to have essentially communistic, Marxist workers' uprisings. It's just that what constitutes the working class is going to shift at that point. So instead of it being the epsilons and the deltas, maybe it'll be the betas at that point. Or if it's all just alphas, then it'll be the alpha minuses against the alpha pluses. Or even if it's just all alpha pluses, then it'll be whatever alpha plus is relegated to the most degrading and base and boring job. So you'll still have... Or the robots, yes. But I'm talking about on the level above what the robots are capable of doing. And then to your point, Dracky, we were talking last time about the Star Trek solution of space, the final frontier. There's infinite room to grow and expand. That solves the problem of resources and having a bigger bottle, but it doesn't solve the problem of the actual labor that's being done, right? So robots and AI will still follow us. Like, one thing I've always been sort of critical of Star Trek for is and this is sort of in hindsight, like Gene Roddenberry thought of a great many things and was very prescient on a lot of it. But if we were to rewrite it today, knowing what we know about AI and the rate at which it's progressing and how it will progress by the time we get to the Star Trek universe, the robots will pretty much be doing everything on the ship. And at that point, the humans themselves won't even really be piloting anything. They won't even really be setting the courses. They'll just kind of be along for the rides like a dog in the car, looking out the window, having fun, exploring. And that's pushing like hundreds, if not thousands of years into the future. We can imagine it growing still further from there. So I think ultimately human beings will have to transcend being mere mortals. And it's just a matter of a race against time as to whether we're able to do that or not before we have this mass tempest in the form of technological unemployment that
Well, I
leads
mean, what's happening right now is that it's literally we're just having we're shedding them. So you look at like the Rust Belt, it's like what are they getting hit by? They're getting hit by like drugs and depression and suicide. So it's just like the number of populations that are going to get hit by those sorts of waves are going to increase, and it's just like this really I don't know what's the word. It's like a very callous way of just like allowing the shift to happen and just turning a blind eye.
And you being on the Healthy Gamer forum, I'm sure you've seen in the various channels people bringing these issues to bear and listening to Dr. K talk about them in his streams and so forth. And that problem is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And that's an unfortunate reality that we're going to have to deal with. And again, as I said in the last stream, part of what motivates me to do stuff like this is to be a warning for people and to let them know that this stuff is coming and that nobody's paying attention to it, or very few people are paying attention to it. And it's going to hit us sooner than we think. And we need to start thinking about these things in a very serious way.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Did you guys have any other topics that you wanted to bring up? Because we're getting close to the 3-hour mark.
No, not really. I think we covered everything.
Dracky?
Yeah, I think that's basically my bits on Brave New World.
Yeah, between the two
Metropolis up
sessions.
next.
Yeah, we do have to think about, and maybe we'll do this after the stream, coming up with which topic we want to do next. I had actually thought about doing Fahrenheit 451, given that I've never actually read it, and we're going through a lot of stuff in modern day with regards to text censorship and seeing how that plays. But we can discuss more about that. Maybe we can do the Way of Zen or something. I don't know. We'll figure that out. So one last thing that I wanted to end on, and I wish I had more time to go through my notes and be more thorough about this, but we'll just touch on it briefly. So again, Huxley wrote Brave New World in 1932. This was before robots, before computers, before engineering, genetic engineering, before World War II, before the internet. And yet, a lot of the things that he's talking about are still very applicable today. And it's interesting to see all of the ways in which he was sort of a prophet about things that were going to come, and talking about various forms of technology specifically that have since either come to be made or have yet to be made, that he has a very thorough understanding of, it seems. So I'm just going to go through a couple examples of them. So helicopters and rockets are the primary form of transportation. Rockets weren't even really a thing until, I believe, 1942. And although there were helicopters at that time, they weren't really used in mass transport and commercial transport until after Brave New World was written. Things like undercover cameras. We could think about like Project Veritas and the way that they use infiltration, like having little tiny pin cameras. Huxley talks about that with regards to the one reporter where he has a camera stashed away in his top hat. Obviously, he couldn't really envision computers at that point to think about how they could be shrunken down to our size. But it's really cool to see that he's thinking about that kind of stuff. Television was still really new at the time, and yet pretty much everybody has a TV and uses it quite frequently. Along with that are things like VR and haptic feedback. If you think about the technology that goes into the Feelies, they also are able to replicate various odors, and that's something that even we can't really do all that well yet. And he was thinking about this over almost 100 years ago. Things like automatic showers, automatic massage chairs. Anybody else? Can you think of other examples in which he had sort of really interesting
electronic music.
foresight? Yes, synthetic music. At the time, I think they were still using radio. But yeah,
Well, and he
synthetic
did
music.
like televised sporting events, right? Because that wasn't until the first Olympics that they did that.
Was it? That's interesting. I didn't know
the
that.
first Olympics was actually broadcast by the Nazis. That was the first like Olympic broadcast.
Right, that's true. And even though they had television at the time, most of the way that people got to see movies and news was in the theaters, actually. They didn't even have stuff broadcast into their own homes at that point. And yet he has the recording boxes throughout everything. Something else is riot suppression. So we had talked about this briefly, one of the ways in which they quell people is by gassing them with soma, and which they basically pump out of water guns. So even the riot technology of today, where they're using things like tear gas and pepper spray, aren't even really at that level and aren't as effective. Not to mention using hypnotic suggestion to try and quell them and cater to their actual conditioning.
No, yeah, that one's a little bit like I can just imagine them like trying to play like Beatles songs or whatever over loudspeakers to stop riots.
Imagine there's no heaven.
No, that's what the celebrities are trying to do. They're trying to quell the riot.
Yeah, and look how miserable they are for it. Something else that was kind of amusing. One of the propaganda newspapers that remains within the world state and that is going and harassing John and spreading fake news is actually the New York Times of all newspapers.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right, so we've gone almost 6 hours between the two sessions. That's almost as long as the entire audiobook itself. So I think we've completely exhausted everything that we're going to get out of this. So just like last time, we'll do some final wrap-up thoughts, and then we'll call it there. So, Wunkel, let's start with you.
So final thoughts are that I still like the book a lot. I feel like Lenina is straight up like low-key like the best character in the story, I think. Like it's easy to overlook her and think she's kind of shallow, but like the more you consider her, the more there's like a lot of subtlety in the story about her, and she's just kind of like hidden there behind all the other characters. Yeah.
Dracky, since this is your first time going through the entire book, what did you think?
Yeah, so it's been quite an eye opener. because it's always been like one of those books that's sat in the background, like Orwell's books. And what I want to try find the full movies to take a look at that and see some other interpretations of it.
Yeah. So definitely check out the 1981 and the 1998 one, and then eventually when the TV show and hopefully the DiCaprio version come out, that we'll get to see those as well.
Probably once lockdown's over.
So what did you so I know that Wunkel has read this at least 6 times. So how has your perspective on things changed as a result of reading this?
My perspective on the book as a result of rereading it?
Yeah.
I mean, I used to like be really weirded out by it when I first read it because it was just like so out there. But once you like acclimate it and get used to it, it's like the plausibility of it goes way up in your head, and you start to think more and more that it's like, no, this could totally happen.
And already is happening, and even Huxley himself is terrified at how rapidly it's happening.
Yeah, because the thing is you have to like consider the ways in which the boundaries of how society functions are being pushed, and it's kind of easy to forget how much we've pushed the boundaries already.
Dracky, how has your view on life changed as a result of reading this?
It's definitely been an eye opener, like Wunkel said, and it's really interesting, kind of like to see how similar yet dissimilar it is to what's happening in modern society. I think the thing that hits closest was the way that it treats sexuality and the various age groups, and there's kind of a correlation to what's happening at the moment.
So if you had to choose between living now versus living in the world state, which would you choose?
Definitely now,
Why?
because they've turned away from the machine god's true will.
Ah, all right. So for my own thoughts, you know, I'm still gripped with the moral and physical, the moral and I can't talk right now. I'm tired. I'm still gripped with the moral and philosophical implications of where it is that we're headed. And since actually finishing rereading it from last time till now, and having seen Mon's answer to the question of how we're going to deal with the robotic displacement and all the rest, I guess I would say I've sort of had a begrudging and resigned acceptance that this is something that's going to happen. And for the vast majority of people, they probably won't even know the difference. And for most of them, they'll probably be happy. For a handful that are aware of what's going on, they clearly won't be. And for anybody who has to suffer between now and the implementation of the world state, obviously they will suffer tremendously, and they will try and resist it with the entire force of their being because, of course, their own survival, their own free will, their own families, and everything that they hold dear is going to become called into question. I think, as I said in the last stream, part of this is pernicious because you can also see good arguments for many of the things that are implemented if they're implemented slowly over time by varying degrees, rather than it all just happening at once. So much like we have a generation right now who has grown up never not knowing the internet, and who the next generation will probably grow up never not knowing a life without, say, self-driving cars, and then people from the older generations shrieking and crying that all of these things are terrible and dangerous. You know, I think we should be cautious, but also optimistic about a lot of stuff that is coming down the pipeline. There's stuff to look forward to as well as stuff to fear. And I think with all of these dystopian futures, there seems to be one sort of unifying thread among all of them that is missing, and which is the inciting incident of the entire problem. And it's lack of a respect for individual liberty and the ability of people to go their own way, to live their own life without influence or interference from others, and to basically opt out and to choose for themselves what other people might decide is a less than ideal path, something that maybe is self-harming, but ultimately that's their choice. And so much like we have Bernard and Helmholtz and John and all the other people who get sent off to the islands, I think the solution in the end is to preserve what's working for the vast majority, but allow an escape clause for anybody that's not.
I don't know. I think actually the most pernicious aspect is the creeping in of like entertainment and pleasure, right? Because that is the basic like commodity of the Brave New World. And if you look at what technology has done and the direction we've been going in the last since the book came out, is that we've been pushing the bounds like of pleasure and entertainment more and more and more, and it's becoming more readily accessible and more I don't know, what is the word? It's like we're using it more and more. It's like we're hitting the point where it's like we have Healthy Gamer, which is like literally about trying to help people that play video games too much. So it's like that is the basic enabler of the Brave New World, and it seems like the internet and computers have sort of enabled it to reach new bounds in bringing itself towards the Brave New World.
So people who have no responsibilities, but all they do all day is play.
Yeah, well, it's about lethargy and just overuse.
Much like the mouse utopia, they've become addicted to pleasure, and it's killing them softly.
Yeah, and what it does is it accelerates the issue, because instead of being capable of fighting the tide of where we're being pushed, it leaves us unable to resist that tide.
So much like John is starting to see at the end, but never really quite gets to, there needs to be more of a healthy balance between work and play. So a general rule of thumb that I've often heard, and that I would say is generally sound advice, there are only 24 hours in a day. You divide them up into 8 hours of work, 8 hours of play, 8 hours of sleep. And so you don't want to be so regressive that you become like the savage reservation, but you don't want to become too woke and progressive that you become like the world state. You want something that's sort of halfway in between, a Hegelian dialectic, as it were, where you have ultimately synthesis of the best of both without all of the horrors of either. So people need to have a sense of purpose and meaning, even if it's self-created and self-driven, even if it's somewhat artificial, focusing on what they can do to make themselves useful and contribute to the world, but also learning to enjoy themselves as well and to give others the same opportunity. to respect their rights and their liberties, and to each their own. You know, part of the problem with these dystopian societies is that everybody is trying to be form-fitted to the same thing. You know, even though there is the caste system in Brave New World, everyone is still form-fitted to be a member of the caste system, and the society can't tolerate anybody who's outside of the caste system. So those people need to be given the option to walk away. You know, like Neo, like the people in Zion, they need to be given the opportunity to choose for themselves to reject paradise, even if that seems maddening to everybody else. So in the end, I think personal freedom solves all of these problems. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me through this, and look forward to doing the next one. And
Yeah.
And thank you to everybody who's been listening to both of these streams. I know it was very long. Hopefully you got something out of it. One last thing I'll end on is a bit of an announcement. So first of all, I would recommend that everybody read this book for themselves and take what we've said here and try and draw their own conclusions from that. But beyond that, I am an author myself, and I know that we are currently going through a time of crisis with the current coronavirus pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of people are sitting at home bored, not knowing what to do, looking for something meaningful to do with their lives, something interesting and fun. So part of the way that I have decided to help in what limited capacity that I can is that on my website, I am offering free digital copies of my first book, Thelema, Mystic Will, Book 0, The Fool. For anybody who wants it, they can go to the website, to the COVID-19 page, and just enter the password that's written there. And then for the duration of this crisis, they can read that for free. And that'll give them something to do to take their mind off of all this unpleasantness. And I know that while things are tight right now, people are struggling. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy and looks to their own needs first. But, you know, if you are somebody who has the resources and means and is looking to do something good, or even if you like the book and you want to wait until the crisis is over and things return to normal, when you have a bit of funds, you know, if you could go and buy the actual book and the sequels, that would be very much appreciated. But I'm not obligating anyone to do that, of course. That's why I'm giving this one out for free. And I hope that people will take that and find meaning in that as well, because one of the main themes of that book is the same topic of meaning and purpose and finding one's true will. So thank everybody for listening. Wunkel and Dracky, thank you for joining me on this, and we'll talk to you guys after the stream. Did you guys have any final remarks you want to say?
Nope, I'm good.
Just wanted to say thanks for having me here, and it's been a really great discussion. Look forward to the next one.
Yep, likewise. Right. Take care, everyone.